The immense differences found between Slavic countries in terms of both LGBTQ legislation and public opinion should never be underestimated, and while already large, this divide between countries in the Slavic world only continues to expand more with every passing year. Some Slavic countries, like the ones topping this list today, are becoming regional leaders in LGBTQ rights and social progress, while those residing on the lower half of this list actively persecute our community and create environments ever more hostile to secular values and personal liberty alike. Today, we are going to explore all 13 Slavic countries and rank them from best to worst in terms of LGBTQ rights and societal acceptance. We will accomplish this by taking into account data from two of the most trusted and thorough LGBTQ rights and public opinion monitoring resources, Equaldex and the Global Acceptance Index from UCLA's Williams Institute of Law. The scores that each country receives on this list today from both will be combined and averaged out in order to achieve the most well-rounded and comprehensive final score that takes both legislation and general societal acceptance into account. Now, as a perhaps somewhat interesting side note, I have spent over a month in nearly every country on this list apart from the last 3. But while I have many personal experiences in 10 of these 13 countries, the scores that each receive are based purely off of the data and obviously do not take into account my personal anecdotes or feelings whatsoever. Still, despite my experiences playing no role in the creation of this data-based list, I may briefly share some of my observations as a side note and complement to the data. In fact, I have spent nearly 3 years of my life cumulatively living in Slavic countries. My boyfriend is from a Slavic country, and we are even living in one at this very moment. It has been fascinating for me to dive deeply into the data in preparation for this video, and doing so has mostly confirmed what I have already expected from my real-world experiences in these countries. And now, with all of this out of the way, let's jump into the data and discover where each Slavic country ranks for LGBTQ rights in 2024. We begin our journey in a country that has long had a reputation within the Slavic world as being quite a gay country. For those familiar with Slavic memes, we are of course talking about Slovenia. In fact, it is a trope among right-wing, pro-Russia, and religious incels across Eastern Europe and the Balkans that Slovenia is weak because it is a progressive, secular, and pro-LGBTQ country. But in reality, these very traits often mocked across the region are a large part of what has made Slovenia the most developed, wealthy, safe, and free Slavic country in the world. A fact which of course only makes the anti-queer Putinist radicals even more jealous and angry. After all, jealous and hateful people simply can't stand how successful and prosperous progressive countries are, and in the Slavic world, Slovenia is the definition of success and prosperity. Speaking of which, Equaldex gives Slovenia a score of 66 out of 100, the 38th highest in the world, and on par with countries like Greece and Costa Rica, as well as US states like Kansas and Missouri. Although Slovenia's laws are generally better than these countries and states, public opinion in the country remains subpar, at only around 48%, thus leading to an overall lower score. But while Slovenia's score is relatively respectable by global standards, it is beyond incredible by Slavic country standards, with only one other country on this list today even coming in close behind. In fact, to this day, Slovenia remains the only Slavic country to have achieved marriage equality, which is something that it did back in July of 2022. Changing one's legal gender in the country is also legal, but requires a medical diagnosis. Thankfully, no surgery is required. Furthermore, Slovenia also has robust anti-discrimination legislation covering sexual orientation and gender identity protections in both employment and housing. At this time, no third or non-binary gender is legally recognized in the country, and this is one of the major areas in which Slovenia still can improve legislatively speaking. In terms of LGBTQ societal acceptance, Slovenia received a score of 62, which places the country 34th globally and the best out of all Slavic countries. When both scores are combined and averaged out, Slovenia ends up with the final score of 64, cementing itself as the #1 best Slavic country for LGBTQ people in 2024. Interestingly, Slovenia not only tops the charts in terms of LGBTQ rights and public opinion, but also in terms of its GDP per capita, which sits at over $34,000 USD in 2024, the highest of any Slavic country. This is also true in terms of human development, with a score of 0.962, also the highest score of any Slavic country. So maybe those mocking Slovenia for being gay should consider that the gayest country in the region is also more broadly the best in the region across all metrics, showing once again that societies which embrace liberty and equality also prosper more for everyone else too. On top of these incredible metrics, Slovenia is also a breathtakingly beautiful country that is covered in mountains, forests, lakes, waterfalls, and historic city centers. The capital of Slovenia, Ljubljana, is a tranquil, safe, and magical city worth exploring, and Maribor is another one of my favorite cities in this underrated country. But it is the nature of Slovenia that really takes the spotlight, and is what makes the country so worth a visit for queer travelers. So, for those who enjoy gorgeous scenery, peace of mind, and supporting modern and accepting countries that fight for our rights, Slovenia should definitely be on your list. Moving north now over the entirety of Austria, we eventually arrive in the country that has secured the rank of second best Slavic country for LGBTQ people in 2024, Czechia. This Central European country is probably most famous, at least in the gay part of this community, for its classy film production scene, films people almost certainly watch for their incredible plots and emotional depth. But perhaps Czechia should be better known for its leading record on LGBTQ rights when compared to the rest of Slavic Europe. Equaldex gives Czechia a score of 65, placing the country 39th in the world and just 1 point lower than Slovenia. It is interesting to note that laws in Czechia are a fair bit behind Slovenia's, yet public opinion towards our community is higher in Czechia than in Slovenia, and this is the reason why the country ends up being only 1 point behind first place this year. For those watching from the US, or simply curious for additional context, Czechia is on par with states like Kentucky and Nebraska. Far from perfect, but still immensely better than the majority of Slavic countries, and comfortably in the top 20% of countries globally for queer rights. Czechia does not yet have marriage equality, but does at least have civil unions as an option for same-sex couples. There was a good bit of hope earlier this year that Czechia would achieve full marriage equality, but instead the government only voted to expand existing civil unions to be more similar to marriage, while still ultimately falling short in some key areas. These improvements to civil unions will come into full effect on January 1st, 2025. This could be a subject of a video all on its own, but for now it is at least a step forward in the right direction, which is better than stagnation or backsliding, so we will take it as an intermediate win. Currently, and unfortunately, it is only possible to change one's legal gender after undergoing gender reassignment surgery. But thankfully, this barbaric law has finally been overturned, and starting on January 1st, 2025, a medical diagnosis is all that will be required to change one's legal gender, as the surgery requirement has been dropped. While there is still much work to be done, this is definitely another step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Czechia also does not yet recognize a third or non-binary gender, so this is yet another area in which further improvement is necessary. Now, the Global Acceptance Index gives Czechia a score of 59, 3 points lower than Slovenia, but still an overall impressive score, placing Czechia 38th globally in terms of LGBTQ acceptance. When both scores are combined and averaged, Czechia emerges with 62 points, comfortably securing the rank of second best Slavic country for queer rights in 2024. In addition to its pretty solid metrics across the board, Czechia is also just a generally lovely country and one that I've enjoyed visiting on multiple occasions over the years. Prague, the capital and largest city in the country, gets most of the attention, as it truly is a gorgeous city with incredible medieval architecture, great restaurants, and a more affordable price point than many Western European destinations. But other cities like Brno in the country's east and Pilsen in the country's west are also picturesque and worth a visit. Crime rates are quite low across Czechia, and the country truly is a delight to spend time in regardless of where one decides to visit, so definitely be open to exploring beyond Prague. Outside of the urban centers, Czechia is also home to some gorgeous natural areas, like the famous Bohemian Switzerland National Park. And don't let the name confuse you, this national park is nowhere near Switzerland, but rather in the north of the country along the border with Germany. While there is barely time to scratch the surface when it comes to what Czechia has to offer, the main takeaway is that this Slavic country is without a doubt a regional champion of our community, and while still far from perfect, is definitely worth considering for queer people who want to support good countries that align with our liberal and secular values. Moving south now, we eventually arrive in the Balkans, where the country securing the title of third best Slavic country for LGBTQ rights in 2024 is located: Croatia. Now, Croatia marks a slight turning point in this list, as all countries past this point have pretty substantial failings when it comes to LGBTQ rights and societal acceptance. Still, Croatia and the next 3 countries we will cover are at least what I would label as tolerable in LGBTQ rights, despite their very visible shortcomings. Yes, they are far behind the first 2 spots in the list, but also still viable options for many queer travelers, expats, and investors to consider. Now, Equaldex gives Croatia a score of 58, which places the country 53rd globally and 7 points behind Czechia. Croatia's score is on par with countries like Cyprus and Bolivia, as well as the US state of South Carolina. Unfortunately, the country has yet to achieve marriage equality, and there are currently no signals it will happen anytime soon, due to the country regressing socially in recent years as a byproduct of Russian propaganda and traditionalist politicians stirring up anti-queer sentiment. Civil unions have at least been possible since 2014, which is without a doubt better than nothing. Since 2014, trans people have also been able to change their legal gender without restrictions, which is a massive win for this relatively religious Catholic country. Unfortunately, no third or non-binary gender is currently recognized in Croatia, which is another area in which change is needed in the years to come. In terms of societal acceptance, Croatia scores a bit lower with 51 points overall, as measured by the Global Acceptance Index. This places Croatia 63rd globally and highlights the stark divide between the country's truly decent laws and its many backwards and anti-LGBTQ people. In fact, Croatia has the 6th largest gap on Earth between the legislation and public opinion as it relates to our community. So in short, decent laws, not so decent people. But when both scores are combined and averaged out, Croatia still ends up with a final score of 54.5, quite a bit behind Czechia in second place, but still a solid showing overall, especially when compared to the rest of the Slavic countries we will be covering. And as for visiting Croatia, I have a few tips. If you are arriving around Christmas time, Zagreb, the capital city, is really nice. The Christmas markets are beautiful, and the city has quite a cozy feel to it. In the warmer months of the year, the Dalmatian coast is my personal top recommendation. Cities like Split, Makarska, Trogir, and Dubrovnik are just a few of my favorites along the coast. Islands like Hvar and Brač are also quite lovely, but there are so many islands and towns that I can't begin to name them all or give them all a shout out. But despite these many beautiful locations, it is important to keep in mind the relatively low levels of societal acceptance of our community in the country. Yes, the laws are mostly satisfactory, but I recommend avoiding PDA and probably not wearing any clothing or accessories that are pride-themed just to be safe. Also, I would say that while the country is quite safe for those who are straight and cis-passing, I would personally be hesitant to recommend the country to those who are not, which is obviously very problematic. A lot of religious thinking, along with communist-era thinking, remain in the country, and many people are influenced by anti-queer Russian propaganda. So if you are not straight and cis-passing, I would recommend either staying in very touristy areas or opting for more accepting and advanced Slavic countries like Slovenia or Czechia, just for added peace of mind. Yes, trans legislation in Croatia is in a good place at the moment, but this does not reflect the lack of tolerance we see in public opinion data, and this is why I'm hesitant to give the country a full endorsement. Thankfully, its younger generations tend to be more modern in their way of thinking, apart from the occasional incels impregnated with Catholic and Russian propaganda, that is. And while I would not describe Croatia as a haven for queer rights and acceptance, I would still consider it to be a genuinely viable option for many and far above the global average, which definitely is worth something. Moving north again now, we arrive in the country that has secured the 4th highest score for LGBTQ rights in the Slavic world, and shockingly, it is Poland. Now those who know next to anything about Poland will know that this honestly says less about Poland being good for our community, and more about how not good the other countries on this list are. Unfortunately, Poland has been a pretty terrible place for queer people in recent history, and actually gotten into some serious trouble with the EU, owing in part to its LGBTQ rights record. But thankfully, in recent years, at least 2 major developments have started to change Poland for the better, and now the country is definitely moving in the right direction. The first was the election of a more pro-human rights, pro-Western, and pro-liberty government headed by Donald Tusk. The second was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia is by far the most anti-queer country in Europe, and so anti-Russian sentiment in Poland, due to Russia's wars of aggression against their neighbors, have made Poland slightly more inclined to accept queer people. This increase in acceptance may be in part to spite Russia, and also to differentiate their societies and to brandish their pro-freedom and secular values in the face of Russian theocratic imperialism. So despite Poland's recent past as a terrible place for our community, it is now the fourth best Slavic country in 2024 for LGBTQ rights, which, in light of recent events, is not actually as surprising as it may at first seem, considering these positive trends. Now, Equaldex gives Poland a score of 53, the 63rd highest score in the world and 5 points behind Croatia. This places Poland on par with countries like Namibia and Angola, and lower than any US state. A full 3 points, in fact, behind the worst state in the US, Tennessee. Poland does not currently have marriage equality or even civil unions. Trans people can only change their legal gender after a medical diagnosis has been achieved, and this is often a terribly difficult and stressful process. No third or non-binary gender is recognized in the country either. Anti-discrimination legislation in Poland is also severely lacking, and is not at all comprehensive. Thankfully, in 2022, some employment protections were passed into law, but housing discrimination is still permitted in the country. The Global Acceptance Index gives Poland 52 points, a score that is decent by global standards but quite low by EU and Western standards, leaving much room for improvement on the front of societal acceptance. When both scores are combined and averaged out, Poland ends up with 52.5 points, 2 points lower than Croatia, and landing the country in 4th place for 2024. As for visiting or investing in Poland as a queer person, I definitely have some mixed feelings. The truth is that Poland literally has some of the most beautiful cities in all of Europe. I can't even begin to list all the cities that feel like you're stepping into a fairy tale when you visit. Poland really does have so much to offer, and also has been a pretty incredible ally to Ukraine and the EU over the last couple of years. Currently, these positive changes in Polish society and government seem to be putting it on the path of further rights and acceptance of our community as well. Still, the situation is a bit sticky, and I would say that while Poland is definitely a viable option for LGBTQ travel, it is nevertheless a location that requires a bit more caution, and one where those not passing as straight and cis may want to reconsider in the name of safety. As stated earlier, Poland scores worse than even the very worst US states, and similar to African countries like Angola and Namibia, so take that as you will. I am, however, very hopeful that Poland is now trending in the right direction, and in a few years will be a far safer and more accepting place. And this makes me personally very happy, as Poland has the potential to be a truly incredible country, considering its majestic architecture, great food, rich history, and many beautiful natural areas, all of which are things I am grateful to have experienced. I just hope that Poland keeps improving so that our entire community can be safe when visiting. Moving one country to the south now, we arrive in Slovakia, the 5th best Slavic country for LGBTQ rights in 2024. In many ways, the situation in Slovakia is quite the opposite to that of Poland. While Poland has been trending in a positive direction over the past couple of years, Slovakia has begun moving in the wrong direction. The country recently elected an anti-queer, pro-Russia wannabe dictator, and ever since the election of Fecal Matter Fitzo, the entire country is rapidly becoming worse for all those who support a secular and free society based on fair rule of law. For this reason, it is important to note that while Slovakia currently holds the rank of 5th on this list, it will likely be falling rapidly in the years to come. Slovakia is firmly in the hands of Russia and China now, along with Hungary, Serbia, and Belarus, and no longer is a functioning member of the liberal Western world order. Now, Equaldex currently gives Slovakia a score of 51, 2 points behind Poland, and placing the country 74th globally in LGBTQ rights, far behind even the worst US states, and behind countries like Mozambique and Cambodia. Slovakia does not have marriage equality or civil unions to this day. Changing one's legal gender in the country is only possible with a medical diagnosis, and until 2023 also required sterilization. The process remains one steeped in stigma and purposeful bureaucratic headaches. The country also does not recognize a third or non-binary gender. The Global Acceptance Index gives Slovakia a score of 48, coming in 70th in the world. When scores from each metric are combined and averaged, Slovakia ends up with 49.5 points, 3 points behind Poland. Unfortunately for our queer siblings in Slovakia, this score will likely be far lower in the years ahead unless fundamental political change sweeps the country. I've actually been to Slovakia and even stayed with a Slovak family for a portion of my time, as they were friends of a friend. And while I overall enjoyed my time and was treated with hospitality, the casual homophobia and religious extremism randomly injected into conversations was wild, and thankfully, they had no idea about who I was or what I believed. The privilege of being able to pass as cis and straight are real. I spent most of my time in Košice, a city in the east of the country, and also in the countryside near the Polish border in the Tatra National Park area. Sadly, the situation in Slovakia for our community is not only bad, but getting more dangerous and hostile with every passing day. And until things change, Slovakia is simply not a country that I can currently recommend in good faith, despite it technically being in the category of mostly tolerable LGBTQ travel destinations, owing to its still somewhat decent laws. Laws which unfortunately may be changing in the near future for the worst. Moving back to the Balkans now, for the 6th best Slavic country for LGBTQ rights, we arrive in Montenegro. In the late 2010s, Montenegro gained a bit of a positive reputation for being more progressive than its neighbors and passing some region-leading legislation. But in recent years, Montenegro has seen one of the largest and quickest declines in history for LGBTQ rights, something I cover in another video. But despite this, the country remains the 6th best on the list, and hopefully in time will start heading in the right direction again. Equaldex gives Montenegro a score of 54, the 62nd best in the world and behind countries like Venezuela and Vietnam. Its 54 points also place it lower than the worst US states. This is mostly due to its grotesquely low public opinion data, currently sitting at 36 out of 100, highlighting the divide between the country's decent laws and generally backwards and religious Orthodox Christian population. In fact, a 2022 poll from the World Value Survey found that less than 4% of Montenegrin respondents felt homosexuality was justifiable, on par with polls from Middle Eastern countries like Iraq and Iran. Montenegro's desire to join the EU is likely one of the only reasons why any positive laws have ever been passed in the country. In 2021, Montenegro finally introduced civil unions, but the rights such unions entail are far less than that of true marriage equality. Changing one's legal gender in Montenegro still requires surgery, which is obviously inhumane and massively shameful. And no non-binary or third gender is recognized by the country either. Montenegro receives a score of only 35 points from the Global Acceptance Index, 112th in the world, and even below countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Uganda. This just drives home the point that while Montenegro has some decent laws, excluding those for trans people obviously, it remains a very backward society with extremely low levels of acceptance. When both scores are combined and averaged out, Montenegro finishes with a final score of 44.5, a full 5 points behind Slovakia in 5th place, and only barely dragged into 6th place by its laws, and with zero help from its religious and backward society. Not only have I been to Montenegro, but I've in fact spent over a month in the country. It is cheap, has pretty good weather, beautiful mountains, and a few years back seemed to be moving in the right direction. But these days, I would not personally go back to the country, nor would I recommend it to others despite its score placing it at the tail end of the mostly tolerable section of this list. For those who do visit, avoid PDA, avoid pride-themed clothing and accessories, and stick to touristy areas. Hopefully in time, things will get better for our community in this country, and hopefully the EU will never let them into the Union until they do, and until their society proves that it is capable of holding modern and secular beliefs based on reason and liberty, not prejudice and Stone Age religion. Moving east now, just one country over, we arrive in a location that marks the start to a new section of this list. I label this and the following 4 countries as the yikes countries, because honestly, that was the first word that came to mind when I was considering their record on LGBTQ rights, and the way that queer people are currently treated inside them. And to start off this list today, we have Serbia, coming in 7th overall. Equaldex gives Serbia a score of 48, 82nd in the world and on par with countries like Albania and Tajikistan. And while the laws in the country are already subpar to say the least, it is the attitude of the people in the country that really make it a terrible place for our community. For example, a 2023 poll in Serbia found that only 22% of respondents would accept their own child if they were LGBTQ. Neither marriage equality nor civil unions exist in the country, and changing one's legal gender requires various medical interventions, including at least 1 year on HRT, and paperwork from a psychiatrist and endocrinologist. No non-binary or third gender is recognized in the country either. The Global Acceptance Index gives Serbia 37 points, which, like Montenegro, places Serbia on par with countries like Iraq, Libya, and Bangladesh. When both scores are combined and averaged, Serbia ends up with 42.5 points, exactly 2 points less than Montenegro, and largely dragged down by its population's bigotry rather than by any particularly terrible laws. Now, a few years back, I actually spent over a month in Serbia and visited 11 cities and towns there, something I would never do again under any circumstance. My decision to visit was driven by multiple factors, including the cheap cost of accommodation, the need to be outside of the Schengen area, and also due to the fact that my boyfriend is from a country in the region, so I decided to give Serbia a shot. I was almost robbed in Belgrade one night when walking alone, and only got away because I'm actually quite a fast runner. Anti-queer sentiments and slurs were used frequently in people's conversations, both in English and Serbian, and my boyfriend does speak Serbo-Croatian, and that was a lifesaver for staying safe. And yes, for any Serbian apologists out there, I will highlight that the country's recent prime minister, who left office in May of this year, identifies as lesbian. But despite this, queer rights have deteriorated under her leadership, and she has done nothing to help the country move past its hate and primitive theocratic idealizations. So unless you have a kink for danger and unpleasant people, probably best to avoid Serbia like the plague. Also know that all money spent in the country goes to support Russia and China in their quest to destroy the liberal world order. Anti-European, anti-LGBTQ, and pro-Russian graffiti cover walls across the entire country, and I eventually had my boyfriend do all the ordering in restaurants because the moment you speak English, the entire attitude of hospitality workers sour. Anti-Black and anti-South Asian sentiment is also rampant in the country and leads to death in some cases, like when a Serbian doctor attacked a pregnant woman of Indian descent. Even though the country scores 7th on this list according to the data, I would probably place it 11th if I were going off of my experiences, considering that its decent laws are the only reason it scores as high as it does, but on the ground the situation is far worse. But this list is based on data, so 7th place it is. Moving now just one country to the west, we arrive in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country taking the 8th spot on our list of Slavic countries by LGBTQ rights in 2024. And, as a small side note, instead of using the country's full name, I will refer to it as BIH, a common abbreviation in the country moving forward. Now, oddly enough, BIH is somewhere that I have spent an immense amount of time over the past couple of years, and one where I have visited many cities and towns in. This has largely been for reasons of affordability and its location outside of the Schengen area, because 3 months out of every 6 non-EU citizens must leave this area, and as BIH is nearby, it is an affordable place to chill until Schengen visas reset. So, long story short, I have a lot of experience with this Western Balkan country. Now, Equaldex gives BIH a score of 51, which places them on par with countries like Cambodia and Singapore, and below even the worst US states. Once again, we see a huge divide between decent laws and an intolerant population. The country does not have marriage equality or civil unions, and this does not seem to be about to change anytime soon, although the country's desire to join the EU could see them eventually introducing civil unions like Montenegro did, simply to impress the EU. Changing one's legal gender in BIH is only possible with surgery, and the country also does not recognize any third or non-binary gender. The Global Acceptance Index gives BIH a score of 29, 144th in the world, and even behind countries like Burkina Faso, Sudan, and Burundi. This just goes to show how much better the laws are in BIH than the amount of public support in the country for our community would suggest, a theme we are starting to see quite a lot on this list. When both scores are combined and averaged, BIH ends up with 40 points and the 8th spot on this list. Now, as someone who has spent about a year cumulatively in BIH, I have noticed that support for our community is far higher in the ethnically Bosniak part of the country, called the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as labeled in blue, whereas support is non-existent in the Republika Srpska, labeled in red on this map. The Republika Srpska is extremely religious, pro-Russia, anti-EU, and obviously anti-LGBTQ. In fact, its ugly troll of a leader even called for attacks against our community and the banning of all LGBTQ organizations in the Republika Srpska. Violence against our community, especially in the city of Banja Luka, has been widespread and is why this part of the country should be avoided at all costs by any queer person who visits the country for some reason. Thankfully, the most interesting parts of the country, and leading cities like Sarajevo, Tuzla, and Mostar, are all located within the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in these parts of the country, support is much higher for our community, and I do feel like visiting locations in the Federation portion of the country is a viable option for people in our community as long as extra vigilance is practiced. Legal issues should not be a problem when visiting, as being LGBTQ is completely legal in the country, despite threats from the Russia-aligned and highly religious Republika Srpska growing rapidly in recent years. Thank goodness they don't have the power to change the laws on their own, and that the Bosniaks are still managing to orient the country more towards the EU, human rights, and hopefully a future where one day everyone in the country will enjoy equal rights and safety. Staying in the region but moving south, we arrive in North Macedonia, a country tied with BIH in terms of overall points. Now, I have visited nearly every major city and town in North Macedonia, and really don't have anything overly good or bad to say about the country, and I think that the data really speaks for itself as a country with tolerable laws but less tolerant people. Equaldex gives North Macedonia 49 points, tied with countries like Botswana and Equatorial Guinea. And following a repeating trend on this list, North Macedonia receives a far higher grade for its laws than it does for its public opinion data. Neither marriage equality or civil unions exist in the country currently, and unfortunately no legislation or court cases seem to be on the horizon to remedy this situation. But perhaps in time, its bid to join the EU will push it in the right direction, but only time will tell. Since 2019, trans people have been able to change their legal gender, but only after undergoing surgery. And in addition to this, the country does not currently recognize any third or non-binary gender. Furthermore, the Global Acceptance Index gives North Macedonia a score of 31, placing it 133rd in the world and similar to countries like Eswatini and Guinea. When both scores are combined and averaged out, North Macedonia receives 40 points, tied with BIH. Despite earning 2.5 points less than Serbia, and thus being ranked lower overall on this data-driven list, I do feel the need to point out that while in North Macedonia, I did not observe any tangible anti-LGBTQ sentiment, as I did in places like Serbia, or even Slovakia for that matter. Yes, the situation in the country is far from ideal, but overall it felt very relaxed in relation to LGBTQ people and rights. I would still say that those who decide to visit should avoid PDA and also refrain from wearing any pride-themed clothing or accessories, as the acceptance in the country is quite low and religiosity quite high. Skopje definitely has some cool architecture and decent restaurants, the area around Lake Ohrid is quite nice, and the self-proclaimed microstate of Vepčani is unique and beautiful. But ultimately, until the situation for our community within the country improves, I feel like this is a place that can be left off of any travel or investment itineraries. Hopefully, in the near future, positive change will come for our people in North Macedonia, and hopefully, this will take place sooner than later, as 9th place in the Slavic world for LGBTQ rights leaves much work to be done. Moving east now, we eventually arrive in Bulgaria, a country that some may not consider to be Slavic enough, but one that nevertheless all my friends in the region said I should include due to it speaking a Slavic language and sharing many cultural traits. Equaldex gives Bulgaria a total score of 38, 103rd in the world, and even behind famously anti-queer countries like Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guatemala. A 2023 poll from Globsec found that only 21% of Bulgarian respondents accepted LGBTI people having rights, with 69% directly opposed, one of the most shocking and disturbing polls ever conducted on the European continent. Marriage equality is explicitly banned under Bulgarian law, and civil unions do not exist either. Since 2023, it has been illegal to change one's legal gender under any circumstances. Before 2023, it was possible after surgery, but not any longer, showing how quickly this country is backsliding into the dark ages of religious domination and hate. In August of this year, the Bulgarian government passed a bill banning the discussion of any LGBTQ-related subjects in school, one of the most primitive Kremlin-styled laws passed anywhere in Europe outside of Hungary, Belarus, and Russia itself. Naturally, this LGBTQ censorship bill was sponsored by the country's largest pro-Russian party and resembles a similar bill recently passed in the country of Georgia. The Global Acceptance Index gives Bulgaria a score of 42, the same as countries like Algeria and Myanmar. When both scores are combined and averaged, Bulgaria finishes with a total of 40 points, tied with BIH and North Macedonia. Unfortunately, due to recent oppressive legislation in the country, Bulgaria's true score is likely a decent bit lower than the numbers we currently have to work with. A couple of years ago, I actually road-tripped around Bulgaria for over a month and got to see a good portion of the country. This was of course before its anti-trans legislation of 2023 and before its censorship legislation of 2024. Looking back now, it is hard to not regret the time and money I spent in the country, a country where less than 30% of the population believes that queer people deserve any rights whatsoever. And while Bulgaria certainly has beautiful mountains, architecture, and interesting cities, I highly recommend boycotting this country until things fundamentally change. At the moment, Bulgaria is fully committed to undermining the European Union and NATO from within, and to erasing our community as completely as they possibly can. Things will likely only keep getting worse in the years to come if the last 2 years are anything to go off of, as rampant anti-queer and racist hate crimes go completely unchecked in the country. As the poorest country in the EU, and the one with the lowest Human Development Index score, it is not surprising that its leaders behave the way they do in service to radical Orthodox Christian ideology. Clearly, at this time, Bulgaria has no place in the liberal world order, and its time in the Western organizations has done little to bring the country into the 21st century. And yes, this picture is from this very year. Moving northeast now, we arrive in a country that I imagine many would have expected to see higher up on this list. The country of Ukraine. Many people are not aware of the fact that before Russia's invasion, Ukraine was actually quite a religious, backwards, and traditionalist country with many of the same levels of hate as seen in Russia itself. The war has rapidly begun to change this, however, and now Ukraine is quickly becoming a leader of queer rights in the Slavic world, but this definitely will take time. The change of heart we are seeing in Ukraine is likely driven in large part by two major factors. On one hand, Ukraine's leaders know that they need Western support and that abusing human rights is not a good way to achieve that support, so pursuing a more progressive stance on queer rights is practical. In addition to this pragmatic reason, many people in Ukraine have now been well acquainted with Russian hate and intolerance and want no part of it. They want to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, and one way this is done is by actually supporting liberty and freedom. The war has also made many in Ukraine reevaluate their values and see the hypocrisy and bias in the pro-Russian Orthodox Church, and also to realize that traditionalist ways of thinking always lead to war and poverty. Over the last 2 years, the Ukrainian government has routinely expressed its desire to greatly expand LGBTQ rights after the war is over. Additionally, the general public in Ukraine has also warmed up to LGBTQ people and rights immensely over the last couple of years. But these improvements are simply not yet reflected in the data, and while the country is on an amazing path socially, it is also at war, and reform around LGBTQ rights and acceptance is understandably not the top priority at the moment. Survival is. With this in mind, consider that the data for Ukraine from Equaldex is from early 2024, but the data from the Global Acceptance Index is from 2021. If we had current data for Ukraine, they would likely be far above the 11th spot on the list, but for now, we can only use the numbers we have access to. Equaldex gives Ukraine a score of 50, only 1 point behind countries like Slovakia and BIH, which makes sense because Equaldex's data is more current and reflects more of the recent improvements that have been made in the country. Currently, Ukraine does not have marriage equality or civil unions, but this is likely to change in the near future for the better. Since 2016, trans people in Ukraine have been able to change their gender without the need of surgery, but a medical diagnosis is still required. Ukraine also does not recognize any third or non-binary gender at this time, but hopefully this will change in the near future too. Now, while Ukraine's more up-to-date Equaldex score is quite decent, and on par with countries higher up on this list, data from the Global Acceptance Index is 3 years old and obviously predates the war. At this time, Ukraine was given a measly 29 points, tied with BIH for the lowest score on the metric. Still, despite this slightly outdated data and immense progress the country has made in the last 2 years, Ukraine's combined and average score is 39.5, only 0.5 points behind Bulgaria, North Macedonia, and BIH. Once the war is over, and the data made more current, Ukraine may very well be near the top of this list, but only time will tell. For now, though, the country remains a war zone and is best avoided until they hopefully win the war and their freedom in the process. Before we dive into the final 2 countries on our list today, I wanted to quickly invite you personally to become a citizen of the Queer Kingdom and join our quickly growing community. You can officially join the kingdom here on YouTube for $1 a month, which will help me make this channel my full-time focus as soon as possible. Also, you will get access to some cute custom queer emojis and epic crown icons next to your comments on this channel that change and evolve the longer you are a member. You can check the comments below and see if you can spot any existing members and their crowns. They were definitely fun to design and I hope you like them. Also, while monthly live streams are always public, they are eventually moved to the members-only feed afterwards. Also, controversial videos covering heavy subjects that are not quite YouTube-friendly are also privately posted for citizens of the kingdom so that we can all stay informed. And finally, joining the Queer Kingdom here on YouTube gives you the ability to chat with me and fellow members through access to our new Queer Kingdom Members Discord. I greatly look forward to meeting you and working together to create a safe and prosperous world for our people one step at a time. Moving now to the country directly north of Ukraine, we arrive in Belarus. Referring to Belarus as a country does feel a bit odd, however, as every part of their government is directly controlled by Russia, and not in the same sense as in Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, or Bulgaria, where the influence is very high, but in a more literal sense, where the country can hardly be described as independent at this current moment in history. Now, it likely will come as a surprise to few that Belarus is the second worst Slavic country for LGBTQ people and rights in 2024. The amount of hate crimes, attacks, censorship, and persecution that take place against our community in this country are too numerous to even begin to cover. So today, we will simply go over the data and save a deeper dive into this horrid place for another time. Equaldex gives Belarus a score of 28, placing them 131st in the world and behind famously anti-LGBTQ countries like Haiti, Turkmenistan, and Pakistan, scoring only 16 points for public opinion, one of the lowest on Earth. Obviously, marriage equality and civil unions do not exist in the country and are in fact banned. Since 2020, even publicly supporting LGBTQ rights in person or on social media is punished with prison. And while changing one's legal gender in the country is technically possible with medical interventions, in practice it is next to impossible for the vast majority in the country. Anti-discrimination legislation not only does not exist in the country, but the government encourages attacks on the community and discrimination from employers and landlords. Now, the Global Acceptance Index gives Belarus a score of 34, also below countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and even Yemen. The fact that privately identifying as gay or trans in the country is technically legal is the only reason why Belarus scores better than such countries overall. When both scores are combined and averaged, Belarus emerges with a final score of 31, a score that is beyond atrocious. It goes without saying that Belarus should be avoided at all costs and in every circumstance by LGBTQ people, and even just people in general who value freedom and human rights more broadly. Maybe one day they will get out from under Russia's boot, but until then, Belarus will remain one of the worst places in the world. And now, the title of absolute worst Slavic country for LGBTQ people in 2024 goes to, drumroll please, Russia. Shocking, right? You may have noticed that Russia was mentioned frequently throughout this list, and the reason is simple. Russia is not content with persecuting its own queer people, it feels the need to get other countries to do so as well, especially countries it considers to be its rightful vassals, which of course includes all Slavic countries, but goes far beyond the Slavic world, as Russia sponsors anti-queer propaganda across the entire planet, from the USA to countries across Africa. This is why Russia comes up so often in discussion about LGBTQ rights. It is impossible to address the issues in countries, especially Slavic ones, without mentioning the driving forces behind many of these problems: Russia and religion. It likely comes as a surprise to few, then, that Russia has the lowest score across the board as it relates to LGBTQ rights. In fact, the country has literally jailed people in the last year for wearing pride-themed earrings in public. Now, Equaldex gives Russia a score of 23, which places it 145th in the world and behind many of the countries we associate with being the worst human rights offenders on Earth. Even the simple act of being gay is not legal across the entire country, and while being gay privately is legal in most of the country, being openly LGBTQ of any kind is not legal and is met with prison. Even having a rainbow flag in a social media bio has been enough for some people to be arrested. Since 2023, it has been illegal for trans people to change their legal gender in all circumstances, and all forms of gender-affirming care are also banned. Like in Belarus, there are also no anti-discrimination protections in the country, as the government actually seeks to incite hate crimes and attacks. Not shockingly, the Global Acceptance Index gives Russia a score of 33, also below some of the most famous countries in the world for human rights abuses. When both scores are combined, Russia ends up with just 28 points overall, which is not only the lowest score among Slavic countries, or even the lowest score in all of Europe, but in fact one of the lowest scores on Earth, only behind a handful of radically religious African and Islamic nations. While I could go on and on giving more examples of the atrocities currently being committed against our community by Russia, not only within Russia, but outside of their own borders, I believe the point has already been driven home sufficiently. Perhaps in time, if Russia collapses and splinters into multiple smaller countries, the people in this part of the world will finally know liberty and safety from tyrannical theocratic oligarchy. But until then, it is important to stand up to Russia in any way that we can, be it by voting for Kamala Harris for US voters, rejecting far-left and far-right parties for European voters in the future elections, or by making the word known within the global queer community that Russia and everything it stands for is fundamentally against our people's right to exist, and that any Russian victory anywhere in the world means the erosion of our rights. Only if we work together against this evil is there any chance of overcoming it. And now, for our queer news story this week, we have a highly troubling development out of Zimbabwe, where a gay couple in the African country is facing between 1 and 14 years in prison on charges of homosexuality. Zimbabwe remains one of the majority of African countries that still punish homosexuality with prison sentences. Until 2006, only gay men were charged under these primitive laws, but in 2006, the government of Zimbabwe expanded the law to also include women. This highlights the fact that simply blaming colonialism for the ongoing and expanding injustices against our community around the world is a pointless argument that ignores the agency that countries like Zimbabwe have, while also downplaying their leaders' ongoing commitments to the persecution of our people. In order for us to drive effective change, we must first accept that countries like Zimbabwe are choosing to remain strongholds of hate and backwards thinking of their own accord, and that their laws and societies are steeped in a prejudice of their own choosing. Until things change, such countries can never hope to develop socially or otherwise. Unfortunately, data from Equaldex ranks Zimbabwe as one of the countries with the most anti-LGBTQ populations on Earth, with only 10% of its population supporting our community's right to exist. I hope that in the years to come, the international community will finally begin standing up for the rights of our oppressed siblings around the world, enduring prison time, torture, and even death simply for being born the way they are. May these two innocent and brave young men find justice one day, and may we never stop doing what we can to hold evil governments like the one in Zimbabwe accountable with boycotts, public discourse, and diplomatic isolation until human rights are respected. Thank you, friends, for watching and spending time with me today as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. For those interested, you are more than welcome to stay around and join our increasingly powerful kingdom here on YouTube as we fight for our future. Until next time, QK out.